Hello, readers. Welcome to reading class with me, Ms. Taylor. I'm glad you're here. Alrighty, are we ready to read? Do we have our textbook, bookmark, or finger to follow along? Do we have our workbook and a pencil? All right, we're going to remember to track with our finger, to read each word carefully, and to pay attention to those end marks. And when we see an end mark, a period, a question mark, an exclamation point, that is the time when we can kind of take a breath and pause. So we just want to be aware of those end marks so that we can read fluently, but still be able to read out loud and take a breath, continue reading. So we're going to read with accuracy and expression. We're going to understand what's happening in the story, make connections to characters' feelings, and enjoy the story. All right, we know reading is thinking. There are so many things going on in our brains as we're reading. We're making connections to characters and experiences, and especially kind of those feelings that we read about. We're also making connections to things that we already know or things that we've learned about in the past. So we read, Wendy and Sydney were near the volcano, and then remember Sydney fell into the volcano. Well, we can be making connections with like, ooh, I've been in a scary situation before, but we can also make connections to things that we know about volcanoes. Like if you've read about volcanoes, you might know some things about how they work and how hot that lava is and stuff like that. So not only connecting to how characters feel, but also connecting to what we already know in our brains, kind of our background knowledge about certain topics and things like that. All right, so lots of things happening in our brains. And one thing that we might be doing a little bit of today is synthesizing. And synthesizing is when we allow our thinking to change and also generate some new ideas, because this is the last story about Wendy and Sydney. And so a lot of times when we finish a story, we can kind of reflect about or think about and reflect upon what happened and what did we learn from the story and how has our thinking changed and grown. And so maybe we can do a little bit of synthesizing today. All right, so before we finish our story about Wendy and Sydney, we have a few vocabulary sentences to review. We have, without gravity, they were weightless. Without gravity, they were weightless. Wouldn't it be fun to be weightless, to be floating around, to have no weight? And so something that has no weight is weightless. And gravity is that force that pulls things down. So that is the reason that we walk on the earth, that we stay on the ground, that we don't just float around up into space. She demonstrated how animals use oxygen. So she showed how animals use oxygen, and oxygen is that part of the air that we need to survive. And our last sentence, lava erupted from the volcano's crater. Oh, dear. All right, so we are lesson 66, Back on Earth. And in your textbook, this is on page 327. All right, 327. And I think what we're going to do, actually, second graders, this next, these word lists actually they kind of have more to do with the next story. And we are going to skip over the next story, kind of like we did before. We're going to skip over this next story that is about a person named Waldo, and he takes care of animals. And so if you are interested in learning about some animal training, you might want to read this next story. But I think what we'll do, I'm going to skip over this word list because all of these words have to do with the story that we are actually going to skip. But if you wanted to do some reading over winter break, you could read lessons 67 to all the way to lesson 83, I think. We'll have to check on that. But so our next story is about a person named Waldo, and we're going to skip over that story. And so after winter break, we are going to be reading a new story, and that will be in our new book. So if you're wondering, we have been using this textbook with the lion on it. And after winter break, we are going to read the other book that has, I think it has a cougar on it. So there's a different animal on it. But so after we finish our story today about Wendy and Sydney, if you did want to read the next story, kind of the next chunk of lessons, you can read that if you'd like. It will be kind of like an optional thing to read that next story about Waldo. All right, so let's read what happened with Wendy and Sydney. All right, so there we are. Back to Earth. Wendy and Sydney and the other students stayed on Io for 5 days. They went with the scientists who were studying the rocks on Io. They went on a land vehicle that took them 200 miles from the space station to a place where there were big volcanoes, much bigger than Soup Pot. One of these big volcanoes was erupting. The girls and the other students took pictures of the things they saw. Wendy took over 200 pictures. I think I would take a lot of pictures too. She even took some pictures through a telescope. She attached her camera to one end of the telescope and took pictures of the eye of Jupiter. She also took pictures of some of the other parts of the huge planet. She took one picture of a small moon that looked as if it was almost touching the surface of Jupiter. Oh, wow. So it sounds like they did a lot of interesting things in their 5 days on Jupiter. They visited volcanoes, they traveled on a land vehicle, they took pictures, they went with some scientists to study rocks. Ooh. And you can see 2 pictures that Wendy took. The huge volcano is over 2 miles high. This big volcano here. And the other picture shows the enormous clouds that are swirling around to form the eye. And there is the eye of Jupiter. Yeah. It's kind of like this swirling storm, these clouds around Jupiter. The 5 days seemed to pass very quickly. Then it was time to go back to Earth. Wendy felt both happy and sad. I can relate to that if you've ever been like on an amazing trip or an exciting adventure, and then when it ends, you're sort of sad that it ends, but you're also kind of glad that you get to go back home. She was looking forward to getting back and telling her friends and her family about the things she had seen. She could hardly wait to show her pictures to her friends. She could almost hear what they would say when they saw some of the pictures. She imagined their eyes would get big and they would say things like, "Wow," and "That's incredible." Yeah, can you imagine if you went on a trip to Jupiter and took all these pictures and then you came back home, you told your friends and family about it? They would be like, "Oh my goodness, are you serious? You saw what? You fell into a volcano?" Or almost did. Wendy almost did. All right. On the day that Traveler 4 was to leave for Earth, Wendy and Sydney went back to Soup Pod. They felt very strange walking up the path to the rim of the volcano. Yeah, I bet I would feel really strange too, especially if I were Sydney. She almost died in that volcano. But they wanted to take one more look at the place where they had their most frightening adventure. They didn't plan to stay long this time, just long enough to take some pictures. They wanted pictures of the place where the overhang had been and pictures of the inside of the crater. Wendy wanted these pictures more than any of the others. Wonder why she wanted those pictures more than any of the others. What do you think? Yeah, maybe to help explain to her friends and family what had happened in this frightening experience. All right. She took 6 pictures. For the last one that she took, she got down on her belly and leaned over the rim to take a picture of the crater. Sydney said, "Be careful. We don't want to have to save you." Wendy was careful. Be careful. All right. Then there's some dots in the story, and that means part of the story is missing. or that it's kind of changed to be a different setting. And setting means where the story is happening. As the girls entered the space station, again, the automatic voice inside Wendy's helmet said, "You have 40 minutes of oxygen left." Ooh. All right. So remember the last time she left the oxygen, or she left the space station? You remember how much oxygen she had? Yeah, it was like 35 when she left before. And what happened to her oxygen supply last time? It ran out, yeah. But now, why do you think she has so much oxygen now? Yeah, she's not running, she's just walking calmly. Later that day, the students and most of the passengers who had come to Jupiter with them boarded Traveler 4. So they got on the ship. Some of the scientists stayed on Io, and some of the scientists that had been on Io for months left with Wendy and the other students. 2 of these scientists had been on Io for over a year. Wow. So 2 of the scientists had been there for over a year, over 365 days. Wow. Wendy and Sydney hugged Rod. They knew him very well by now. He was a scientist, a very smart one. He was also a very nice person. During the time the girls were on Io, he had explained things to them, had eaten with them, and had been a good friend. For Wendy, it was sad to say goodbye to him. After she hugged him, she had to turn away, because she didn't want him to see that she had tears in her eyes. It must have been sad. The trip back to Earth on Traveler 4 didn't seem to take as long as the trip out to Jupiter. Has that ever happened to you? It's like when you're going to somewhere, it seems to take longer because you're excited about it. And then on the way home, you're like, oh, that was pretty quick. Because we're not as excited sometimes to get back home. In fact, the 4.5 days seemed to go by quickly. Wendy read a lot and made plans about things she would do when she got back to her hometown. What are some things you like to do when you're on your way back from a road trip or a vacation? When Traveler 4 landed at the space station in Japan, the sun was just starting to come up. So it was like really early in the morning. Everybody cheered when the huge spaceship landed. Then the students said goodbye to each other. Cindy and Wendy made a lot of plans. They planned to see each other the following year. They planned to write to each other. They planned to phone each other and to send each other good pictures. So they'd really become good friends. So they want to keep in touch. They're like, oh, we can talk on the phone and we can write letters to each other. And if you have some good pictures, you could send them to me and I'll send them to you. All right. Please read the rest of the story to yourself. Get ready to answer some questions. If you're still reading, please pause the video. So everybody, did Wendy and Sydney get on the same plane? No. And Wendy noticed that the woman next to her was reading a book. What was that book about? The solar system. The woman asked Wendy something that made her laugh. What did the woman ask her about? Yeah, she asked her if she knew that one of Jupiter's moons had volcanoes on it. She's like, oh yeah, I know. All right, let's listen to that part one more time. It is the ending to our whole story about Wendy and Sydney. Then the girls said goodbye to each other. They hugged each other. They cried more. Then Sydney went to her plane, and Wendy went to hers. Wendy felt sad for the first hour of the plane trip back to her hometown. Slowly, she started to feel better as she looked forward to getting home. Suddenly, she noticed that the woman next to her was reading a book about the solar system. The woman was reading a page that had pictures of Jupiter and Io. When the woman noticed that Wendy was looking at the book, the woman said, "Our solar system is incredible." Wendy agreed. Then the woman said, "I was just reading the most incredible facts about Jupiter. Did you know that one of the moons near Jupiter has volcanoes on it?" Wendy laughed and said, "Yes, I do." Then she told the woman about her frightening adventure. Ooh, can you imagine? Be like, well, actually, can I tell you what happened to my friend? All right, so that is the end of our story about Wendy and Sydney. They had such an exciting adventure on Io. Um, and now they are heading back home and kind of looking forward to being home, but also a little bit sad to leave this awesome adventure. So maybe you have had an awesome adventure that you can make a connection with, feeling like, oh, that was so much fun, and oh, I'll never forget that, but also feeling glad to come home. And maybe you've had a connection with meeting a friend. I know we took a little trip last winter and we drove down south and we visited some state parks in Arkansas, and my kids made some friends at a campground, and that was kind of fun to have a little adventure and make some new friends. So I hope you have some exciting adventures over your winter break. And for today, there will be, I'm not going to check homework for today. So our lesson 66 in your workbook is optional. If you would like to finish it and show me a picture, you totally can, but you don't need to. We want to make sure that you don't have homework on this lovely day before winter break. So there is no homework for today unless you'd like to do lesson 66 in your workbook. And if you would like to read the story over winter break that we are going to skip, you definitely can. So that will be starting on lesson 67, and it goes all the way to the end of the story. And then there's even a couple more lessons in our new book. So you can definitely do that. And then when we get back from winter break, we will read a new story. And our new story is in our new book. And let's see, Miss Taylor doesn't have her book upstairs right now. I think, oh no, I'll have to go check what lesson that is. Oh, here it is. I think it is lesson 85. So when we get back after winter break, we are going to read lesson 85 together. So if you wanted to, you could read all the way to lesson 84. And that is a story about someone named Waldo, and he is kind of like an animal trainer. And so if you're interested in animals, you might want to read the story about Waldo. And so that would be lesson 67 to 84. And that will be kind of some optional reading. Have a wonderful winter break, second graders, and I will see you next year. Get it? Because now it's 2020, and in January it's going to be a new year. Have a great winter break. Bye, readers.